September 8, 1943. At 6:30 in the evening, General Dwight Eisenhower's voice crackled across Radio Algiers, delivering news that would shatter the Axis alliance and plunge Italy into chaos. Italy has surrendered unconditionally. The words reached German command posts across Europe within minutes, confirming Hitler's worst suspicions about his unreliable ally. An hour later, Marshal Pietro Badoglio's voice followed on Italian radio, his carefully worded announcement betraying the impossible position Italy found itself trapped within the Italian government, recognizing the impossibility to continue the fight against the more powerful enemy countries in order to save the nation, demanded an armistice. What listeners couldn't know was that this moment had been orchestrated through months of secret negotiations, desperate political calculations, and a fundamental miscalculation about Germany's response. The man delivering Italy's surrender was not Benito Mussolini. The Duce had been arrested 6 weeks earlier, his 21-year reign ending not with dramatic speeches or final battles, but with a vote of no confidence from his own fascist Grand Council. In his place stood Pietro Badoglio, a 72-year-old marshal whose selection revealed everything about the cynical politics driving Italy's surrender. King Victor Emmanuel III had faced two candidates to replace Mussolini. Marshal Enrico Caviglia, known for his principled opposition to fascism, and Badoglio, notorious for his opportunism and willingness to serve whoever held power. The king chose Badoglio precisely because he lacked principles. Caviglia might have acted with honor, but honor was a luxury Italy couldn't afford. They needed someone who would do anything to survive, and Badoglio fit that requirement perfectly. The path to September 8th had been paved with catastrophic military defeats that exposed the fundamental rot within fascist Italy's war machine. By early 1943, Italian forces had been humiliated in North Africa, Greece, and the Soviet Union. The Allied invasion of Sicily in July demonstrated that Italy's mainland was no longer safe from invasion. Public support for the war had collapsed. Food shortages plagued Italian cities. The industrial capacity that Mussolini had boasted about proved inadequate for modern warfare. Most critically, German forces were pouring into Italy throughout the summer, ostensibly as reinforcements, but increasingly viewed by Italian leadership as an occupying army. 3 Italian generals had been secretly dispatched to Lisbon to contact Allied diplomats, but their mission nearly collapsed before it began. The 3 envoys immediately began quarreling about who possessed the highest authority to negotiate. Allied officials had to resolve this bureaucratic farce before substantive discussions could commence. Eventually, General Giuseppe Castellano was selected as the primary negotiator, but the confusion revealed the disorganization plaguing Italian leadership. They were attempting to orchestrate one of the most complex diplomatic maneuvers in military history, while their own command structure was fragmenting. The negotiations exposed Italy's desperate strategic position. Caught between overwhelming Allied military superiority and the increasingly suspicious presence of 19 German divisions throughout the peninsula, Italian negotiators found themselves with virtually no leverage. Allied intelligence reports noted that the outstanding factor was not the character or harshness of armistice terms, but rather that the Italians were not free agents at liberty to do as they pleased. It was a delicate balance in Italian minds whether the Allies or their German allies would work the most damage and destruction in Italy. They were literally between the hammer and the anvil. Badoglio still hoped to extract favourable conditions from surrender. He instructed Castellano to insist that any Italian capitulation be coordinated with Allied landings on the mainland. This condition reflected Italian terror about German retaliation when the betrayal was discovered. The Italians understood that abandoning Germany would trigger immediate and massive German reprisals against Italian forces and civilians. They needed Allied protection, but the Allies were operating on their own timeline, pursuing their own strategic objectives. The armistice was actually signed on September 3rd at Cassibili in Sicily, but this fact was kept absolutely secret for 5 crucial days, while both sides prepared for the announcement. During this period, Italian military leadership remained completely uninformed about the agreement. No orders were prepared for the inevitable German response. No contingency plans existed for protecting Italian forces when the surrender was revealed. The army was not informed of the negotiations in any way. This meant that when the armistice was finally announced, Italian troops were completely without orders, leadership, or coherent strategy. The secrecy surrounding the negotiations created a catastrophic information vacuum. While Badoglio and his closest advisors knew what was coming, division commanders, garrison leaders, and frontline officers had no idea their government had already committed to surrender. They received no instructions about how to respond to German attempts at disarmament. They had no guidance about whether to resist, retreat, or collaborate. This absence of clear orders would prove fatal for hundreds of thousands of Italian soldiers in the hours and days following September 8th. German leadership had been systematically preparing for Italian betrayal since early summer. Hitler's distrust of his Italian allies was well-founded and had prompted extensive planning for the expected defection. As early as May 1943, German High Command began developing contingency plans for Italian surrender. On August 1st, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's divisions began infiltrating northern Italy under the guise of reinforcement. By August 16th, Rommel's headquarters had moved to Lake Garda, and he assumed open command as Army Group B. 5 infantry and 2 panzer divisions were dispatched to northern Italy during August. When Eisenhower's announcement reached German command posts on September 8th, Wehrmacht forces were already positioned to implement Operation Axis, the immediate occupation of Italy and disarmament of Italian forces. The German emotional response to Italian surrender was intense and would colour their subsequent treatment of Italian forces and civilians. Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels recorded in his diary that the Führer was determined to carry out a tabula rasa in Italy. General Alfred Jodl reportedly declared that Italy's betrayal was so monstrous that words failed to express German feelings. Terms like Schweinerei, meaning disgraceful swinishness, and references to the Badoglio betrayal became standard in German communications. This wasn't merely strategic disappointment. German leadership felt personally betrayed by allies they had supported through years of military disasters. The timing of the September 8th announcement became a source of tremendous tension between the Italian government and Allied forces. Badoglio desperately wanted to delay the revelation until September 12th, hoping to gain more time to organize resistance against German forces. Only on the night of September 8th did he learn that Eisenhower intended to make the announcement that very evening. Badoglio's protests were ignored. The Allies were operating according to their own strategic calendar, coordinating the announcement with planned landings at Salerno. Italian concerns about adequate preparation time were secondary to Allied operational requirements. At 7:42 that evening, less than an hour after Eisenhower's broadcast, Badoglio delivered his own announcement to the Italian people. His words were deliberately ambiguous, reflecting the impossible situation Italy faced. Every Italian army action against Anglo-American armies must be stopped, he declared, but Italian forces will react against every kind of attack having other origin. This last clause essentially ordered Italian troops to resist German attempts at disarmament, setting the stage for the violent confrontations that would follow. But without specific orders, without coordinated planning, without adequate preparation, these words would prove to be a death sentence for countless Italian soldiers caught between competing loyalties and unclear commands. The stage was set for one of the most chaotic and tragic episodes in World War II history. Within hours of Badoglio's broadcast, the full magnitude of Italy's miscalculation became devastatingly clear. German forces moved with precision and speed that caught Italian commanders completely off guard. Operation Axis wasn't improvised revenge. It was methodical, systematic dismantling of Italian military power that had been planned for months. Wehrmacht units struck simultaneously across Italy, the Balkans, and southern France, targeting over 1 million Italian soldiers who had no idea whether to fight, flee, or surrender. The chaos was immediate and total. Italian division commanders found themselves isolated, cut off from higher command, facing German ultimatums with no guidance from Rome. Some units attempted resistance based on Badoglio's ambiguous final clause about reacting to attacks of other origin. Others, confused by contradictory orders and the sudden disappearance of their government, simply waited for instructions that would never come. Most tragically, many Italian officers, terrified of communist infiltration and convinced that cooperation with Germany remained preferable to chaos, voluntarily handed their weapons to Wehrmacht forces. Rome itself became the epicenter of this catastrophe. The Eternal City, defended by substantial Italian military presence, should have been capable of organized resistance. Instead, the capital fell to German forces in less than 48 hours. The problem wasn't numerical inferiority or inadequate weaponry. Italian forces around Rome significantly outnumbered their German counterparts. The problem was leadership vacuum and complete lack of coordinated defense planning. Individual military units and armed civilians mounted spontaneous, uncoordinated resistance that was brave, but ultimately futile against Wehrmacht forces operating with clear objectives and unified command. General Calvi's signature on Rome's surrender document at 4 p.m. on September 10th marked more than the fall of a city. It symbolized the complete collapse of Italian military organization. Field Marshal Kesselring had achieved in 2 days what many thought would require weeks of siege warfare. The speed of Rome's capitulation sent shockwaves through remaining Italian resistance forces and confirmed German assumptions about Italian military incompetence. But the most revealing moment of September 8th occurred not in Rome, but in the early morning hours of September 9th, when Italy's leadership abandoned their posts and fled south. King Victor Emmanuel III, Marshal Badoglio, military ministers, and the Chief of General Staff escaped Rome by car, driving through the night to Pescara before boarding the corvette Bayonetta for Brindisi. They sought Allied protection while leaving their armed forces leaderless at the moment when clear direction was most desperately needed. This flight represented the ultimate expression of the cynical calculation that had defined Italy's surrender negotiations. The same leaders who had orchestrated the secret armistice, who had promised their people salvation through negotiated peace, abandoned their responsibilities the moment German retaliation materialized. They had gambled with their nation's survival, and when the stakes became real, they chose personal safety over national leadership. The abandonment of Rome created a power vacuum that German forces exploited ruthlessly. Wehrmacht commanders understood that controlling the capital meant controlling Italian public perception and demoralizing any potential resistance movements. The rapid occupation of government buildings, communication centers, and transportation hubs demonstrated German organizational superiority over their former allies. Within days, Rome was functioning under German administration, while Italian government officials issued proclamations from Allied protected territory hundreds of miles to the south. Italian naval forces faced equally impossible circumstances, caught between armistice obligations and German determination to prevent valuable warships from reaching Allied ports. The tragedy of the battleship Roma epitomized the deadly confusion surrounding September 8th. Following armistice terms, the Roma and accompanying vessels departed La Spezia for Malta, seeking to comply with surrender conditions while avoiding German interference. The fleet received no air support because Allied aircraft were committed to supporting the Salerno landings. When German bombers appeared over the Italian ships near Sardinia, the Roma's crew faced an impossible dilemma. Armistice terms prohibited engagement with Allied forces, but these were clearly German aircraft. The ambiguous wording of Badoglio's broadcast provided no clear guidance. Respecting what they interpreted as surrender conditions, Italian gunners held their fire while German pilots prepared their attack. The Wehrmacht response was immediate and devastating. Fritz Zech's radio-controlled bombs, representing cutting-edge German military technology, struck the Roma with precision that demonstrated months of tactical preparation. Over 1,200 Italian sailors died in the Mediterranean that day, victims not of battlefield heroics or strategic necessity, but of governmental incompetence and communication failures. The Roma's crew had attempted to honor their government's surrender while German forces operated under clear orders to prevent Italian naval assets from reaching Allied hands. The sinking became symbolic of Italy's broader tragedy. Honorable men dying because their leaders had failed to provide coherent direction during the most critical transition in their nation's modern history. The scale of German retaliation extended far beyond Italy itself. Throughout the Balkans, Italian occupation forces found themselves suddenly redesignated as enemy combatants by their former allies. In Greece, on the island of Cephalonia, the Italian Acquae Division faced German demands for immediate disarmament. When Italian officers chose resistance over capitulation, Wehrmacht forces responded with systematic massacre. 1,600 Italian soldiers died on Cephalonia, not in conventional battle, but in organized execution after their surrender. Similar fate awaited Italian units throughout German-occupied territory. These weren't random acts of battlefield violence. German treatment of Italian forces reflected calculated policy decisions made at the highest levels of Nazi leadership. Hitler's determination to carry out tabula rasa in Italy meant comprehensive destruction of Italian military capability and systematic punishment for betrayal. Wehrmacht commanders received explicit orders to treat former Italian allies as traitors deserving maximum retribution. The emotional intensity of German leadership's response to Italian surrender translated into operational directives that prioritized vengeance over strategic efficiency. The tragedy extended beyond military casualties to encompass the broader Italian population. German occupation forces, enraged by what they perceived as treacherous betrayal, implemented harsh measures against Italian civilians suspected of supporting the surrender or harboring resistant sympathies. The collaborative relationship that had characterized German-Italian cooperation throughout the early war years disappeared overnight, replaced by occupier-occupied dynamics that would define the remainder of Italy's war experience. Meanwhile, in Allied-controlled southern Italy, Badoglio's government attempted to maintain legitimacy while having virtually no control over events in German-occupied territory. The marshal who had promised to save Italy through negotiated surrender watched helplessly as his miscalculations produced exactly the chaos and destruction he had hoped to avoid. The price of belated wisdom was measured in hundreds of thousands of Italian casualties and the effective partition of Italy between competing foreign powers. September 8th had revealed the fundamental delusion underlying Italian strategic thinking. Badoglio and his advisors had convinced themselves that surrender could be managed, that timing could be controlled, that Germany would respond rationally to Italian defection. They had calculated the costs of continuing the war, but failed to calculate the costs of abandoning it. The mathematics were brutal and inescapable. Italian leadership had assumed that announcing surrender would end their military obligations. Instead, it had multiplied them exponentially. The miscalculation wasn't simply tactical or operational, it was psychological. Italian leaders had projected their own war weariness onto their German allies, assuming that Hitler's regime would accept Italian withdrawal as a reasonable strategic adjustment. They had fundamentally misunderstood the ideological nature of Nazi commitment to total war. While Italy viewed the conflict through the lens of traditional power politics, where alliances could be adjusted based on changing circumstances, Germany approached the war as an existential struggle where betrayal warranted complete destruction. This cognitive disconnect had profound implications for Italian military preparedness. Because Badoglio's government believed surrender could be negotiated cleanly, they had made no serious preparations for the inevitable German response. No contingency plans existed for protecting Italian forces during the transition. No alternative command structures had been established for communication with isolated units. No stockpiles of weapons or supplies had been positioned for resistance operations. Italian leadership had gambled everything on the assumption that surrender would end their problems rather than create new ones. The German response demonstrated the difference between amateur and professional military planning. While Italian officials debated timing and diplomatic niceties, Wehrmacht commanders had spent months positioning forces, identifying key objectives, and preparing detailed operational plans. Operation Axis wasn't reactive improvisation. It was systematic implementation of carefully rehearsed procedures. German forces knew exactly which Italian units to target, which strategic positions to occupy, and which commanders were most likely to resist or collaborate. The speed and efficiency of German operations revealed another crucial miscalculation by Italian leadership. They had assumed that their own military incompetence was universal, that all armies would struggle with rapid deployment and complex coordination. Instead, they discovered that Wehrmacht forces could accomplish in days what Italian planners thought would require weeks. The German military machine that had conquered Poland in 28 days and France in 6 weeks brought the same methodical efficiency to dismantling Italian resistance. Individual Italian commanders faced impossible choices that their government had failed to anticipate or prepare them for. Division leaders found themselves isolated, receiving contradictory information from multiple sources, forced to make life and death decisions without clear guidance or adequate intelligence. Some chose resistance based on personal honor and military tradition. Others chose collaboration based on practical assessment of their hopeless tactical situation. Most simply waited, paralyzed by uncertainty and the absence of coherent orders from higher command. The psychological impact on Italian soldiers was devastating. Men who had served alongside German allies for years suddenly found themselves designated as enemies by former comrades. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Italian troops had been trained to coordinate with Wehrmacht forces, to share intelligence and resources, to view Germans as brothers in arms. Overnight, these relationships were redefined as adversarial, but no corresponding tactical or strategic guidance accompanied this transformation. The breakdown of Italian command structure created a leadership vacuum that individual initiative couldn't fill. Junior officers found themselves commanding units without knowing their strategic objectives or their government's intentions. Non-commissioned officers made tactical decisions that should have been made at division level. Individual soldiers chose between competing loyalties based on incomplete information and personal instinct, rather than professional military assessment. This chaos cascaded throughout Italian-occupied territories, where garrison commanders faced similar impossible circumstances. Italian forces in Yugoslavia, Greece, and Albania had spent years establishing administrative control and local relationships. September 8th suddenly transformed them from occupation forces into potential resistance fighters, but without the preparation, resources, or coordination that effective resistance required. Many units found themselves outnumbered and outgunned by German forces that had anticipated this exact scenario for months. September 8th, 1943 stands as one of history's most catastrophic miscalculations. A day when Italian leadership chose surrender as salvation only to discover it was damnation. Badoglio's government had convinced themselves they could control the timing, manage the consequences, and negotiate their way out of total war. Instead, they unleashed chaos that consumed their nation and destroyed the very forces they had hoped to preserve. The lesson transcends military history. When leaders prioritize political survival over strategic reality, when they mistake wishful thinking for planning, when they assume their enemies will respond rationally to betrayal, the mathematics become inescapable. Italy's generals didn't just admit defeat on September 8th. They guaranteed it would be as brutal and complete as possible.